the objectives of your movement? What are the main challenges, in effect, that you are facing now? These are some of the cluster of questions that I've just asked you to consider in whatever way you wish, but mainly to just reflect on the movement that you've led, the success that it's had, and where do we go from here? We'll start again with you, Cindy.
Well, I think the greatest victory is actually the thousands of children who are now standing with First Nations children to really call for justice and an end to this discrimination. They are from all walks of daycare and all walks of school and youth groups, and all of them realize it doesn't take any money to make the world a better place. It just takes standing together to end discrimination in all of its forms. Just last Friday was Bear Witness Day to honor Jordan River Anderson, the founder of Jordan's Principle. And children all across Canada brought their teddy bears to daycare and to school to honor Jordan, to remember him and his sacrifice, because he was a First Nations little boy who never left the hospital because of his racial status, because governments fought over who should pay. But the teddy bear recognized more than that. It was their commitment to not allow that to continue to happen to any child in this country. And it was a symbol of their own efficacy as children in being able to shape a Canada that the adults have been unable to realize for on their behalf. That to me is the greatest benefit. Of course, thanks to the now 8 orders, we've had 7 non-compliance orders since the original order in 2016. The Canadian government is beginning to comply, and this past year alone, over 250,000 services and products have gone out to First Nations children in Jordan's name that wouldn't have otherwise been provided. And we're having a conversation in this country about child welfare. But I think the missing ingredient is really why governments aren't doing better in child welfare when they know better. Why are we not addressing the water shortages, the addiction services inequities, the mental health inequities that drive child welfare? We can change legislation, we can tinker around on the edges, but until we get to the core of that substance, the very kind of the DNA piece around our normalization of the discrimination and our refusal to accept that First Nations do have solutions to be able to care for their own children, then the progress we make will be marginal. I think I've learned one important lesson, and it was really thanks to the maintenance man outside of Gandhi's museum in Delhi. I had spent so much time trying to talk to the government to try and get them to do the right thing. And I would continue to talk to the government and continue to do studies and try and do a better study. And I went to see I was in Gandhi's museum, and I'm one of the type A people who sees the 5 top highlights and go out the door and spend most of my time in a gift shop. But I was with somebody who's much more meticulous, so I had to wait. But I was outside, and the maintenance guy was having smoking a cigarette and asked me what I did. And I told him all the trials of trying to get Canada to address these situations and trying to get them to understand the human crises that they were putting in place, indeed the deaths of children, the losses of childhood, and how we study it again and we get them to agree and they do it. And finally I ran out of breath, I think much to his relief. And he said, let me get this straight. You talk to them, you work with them, they agree with the problem, they agree with the solution, they do nothing, and you do exactly the same thing over again. He said, didn't you learn anything in that house? He says, your conversation needs to be with the Canadian people, not with the government. Governments don't create change, they respond to change. And that was a turning point, and something I'm trying to get better at that conversation as I go. But now I have thousands and thousands of little people who are mentoring me along on that trail, and I feel absolutely blessed.
I have to say, seeing as I hear you talking about children's rights, I remember something that my daughter taught me when she was 15 years of age. She's now about to become 40. It was the most important human rights lesson that I was ever taught. And she said to me, Daddy, if you want to know what the real test of human rights is, always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is what is happening good for children? Is it good for children, Daddy? That's the real test of human rights. It's something I never forgot, and you've illustrated it so dramatically for us now. Ebrahim?
Thank you very much. Of course, South Africa, as I said, was a democratic state. It was a constitutional state with a very, very strong civil society, with a very independent constitutional court, and with other organs of state that protects human rights. Of course, we passed legislation now against hate speech. We did experience no one against hate speech. You do have a shift to the right, some shift to the right, especially people who are looking over the old apartheid system. You have populism now that is growing to the left. And the problem is with the economy of the country, because the economy doesn't grow. And with a high unemployment rate of 27%, you do find some type of tensions developing. Why would a person of Indian origin should get a job, but not an African, that type of thing. But I don't think it's an issue that is of much concern. It's a very serious issue. Social cohesion, I think, is holding in South Africa. And with, other than the economic problems, you have examples of hate speech which the law enforcement agents have taken action against them. There was one white lady now was sentenced, I think, to 18 months because she said something derogatory against the blacks. So the system is holding, and I think that, mind you, we have 11 official languages there because we have 9 ethnic groups. Then we have 4 main racial groups. Now to hold them together in one country, in a democratic system, I think it has been an achievement. And there has been some problems in government, in the institution, which I think our president, we just had an election, which is on his way to address.
I think South Africa is one of the most comprehensive, not compelling, bills of rights in the world, and I have to say that your jurisprudence on freedom of expression and hate speech is actually a model, and one that many democracies can draw upon in terms of not only protecting freedom of expression as a fundamental freedom, but also recognizing when hate speech has crossed the line. So your country in that as well has been a model. Professor Gandhi, your reflections?
Well, I already mentioned something, in my earlier remarks, but I'll say this. Despite some very troubling things that are happening in Indian society today, in the Indian polity, in the Indian nation, of course everybody knows that India has made gigantic strides, tremendous strides in so many areas, which gives us very great pride. When Gandhi was still living, a remarkable African-American scholar called William Stewart Nelson from Harvard University, Washington, D.C., was in India, and he spoke with Gandhi. And he said, "You have been preaching non-violence to India for 30 years, but why has so much violence taken place?" Because that was the time when Hindu-Muslim killings very sadly had disfigured so many parts of the subcontinent. So Gandhi thought for a while, and then he said something, and here again I'm paraphrasing, these are not his exact words, but something like this. He said, "I've been asking Indians for such a long time to fear not and hate not, They loved and followed the first lesson, they were not so keen on the second lesson. And Gandhi said that the hatred of the white man can easily get transformed into hatred of your fellow Indian. Hatred of the Hindu in the Muslim, the hatred of the Muslim in the Hindu, and so forth. I think that is something to keep in mind. Really that, as I think has been mentioned, if violence is to be tackled, hate has to be tackled. It has to be tackled in the home, it is to be tackled from the pulpit, it is to be tackled from the nation's bully pulpit. So that has not been done enough, I fear, in our country. There's something else about India, which is, and is perhaps true for other parts of the world also. We have so many groups. If you know, some of you have heard of the caste system and you've heard of the fourfold division. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there are a few thousand divisions in Indian society. And it's very easy to find another group to blame for whatever may be deficient in your area. And as a student of history and a student of the world, I found this, and this is true of, it's well known, or rather it's an obvious truth, but in this case, this is a truth, an obvious truth, confirmed through painstaking research, which is this. We Indians have opinions about our neighbors, but we don't have knowledge about our neighbors. We don't take time to listen to them. We don't know our neighbors. And what you said, you know, your conversation with the maintenance person, go to the Canadian people. So we Indians have to go to one another, to listen to one another. And one piece of work in which I've been engaged also for 50 or 60 years, in addition to speaking truth to whoever is willing to listen through my writing, my friends and I, about 55 years ago, we created a center in Western India, in the hills of Western India, where we encourage listening to each other, dialogue, listening to one's own conscience, and together seeking some reconciliation if possible. So, and we are not the only people doing this. There's so many other people with different umbrellas, different names, different titles are doing this kind of work. So some very worrying things are happening in India, and some wonderful positive things are also happening in India.
Our round of questions, and I know that what I'm asking now, you all touched on it in some way, and so feel free to respond to it in whatever way you deem appropriate. The main question I'm putting now is, at a time that democracies are themselves beset by so many burdens, whether we have a liberal populism, let alone the resurgent global authoritarianism, let alone patterns of xenophobia and the like. What are the lessons to be learned from your nonviolent struggle as to how to meet the challenges that democracies are facing today, which includes also the very loss of belief in the importance of democracy, in the values of democracy, in the institutions of democracy, particularly among younger people who never experienced maybe the totalitarianisms of the past, yet have increasing skepticism about the democracies of the present. Cindy?
We have a paradox in that we have an interconnected world thanks to social media and Google than we've ever had in our lifetime. And yet I think our own worlds have become smaller when it comes to the compassion that we exercise for those around us. It is a paradox that only can be reversed, in my view, by raising a new generation of children. And that means that we don't just focus on youth engagement. In some ways that's too late. that we build a foundation of loving and peaceful civic action in every child from the earliest age, and we mentor that along. There has never been a generation, in my view, that needs to be so prepared to tackle the difficult and sometimes the hatred from around the world, from our different members of our community, as well as in our political leaders, as the one right now. And we can't wait until they're 20 and 25 and voting in order to instill those messages. Our real opportunity here is to reduce the number of bystanders in society. Reduce the number of people who gate themselves in and say that I'm not smart enough to be a part of this movement, I don't know enough to be a part of this movement, someone else will do it. I say that as a person who has some authority, because that was exactly what I did for many years. We must overcome our own insecurities and demonstrate that love in an action of justice for our fellow human beings, and we must teach our kids to grow up and get into lots of trouble for doing the right thing.
Yes, I think it's the South African situation. We have a whole generation, what we call loosely born free. The young and the youth who are not part of the struggle. Some of them don't even understand what apartheid was like, you see. And whether they pose a threat to democracy, I'm not sure, because I think it's a responsibility of people of our generation to guide them, tell them exactly, this democracy was born by blood and tears. It didn't just come from heaven. And I think that there's a lot of youth activities that we are now involved in. For the young people to understand where we come from and what is the meaning of democracy, and why is it that we need a democratic South Africa that will secure the future, and not some type of an authoritarian or a dictatorship. I think that, you see, one point I'd like to make is that engaging in non-violent struggle does begin to shape your political thinking and your political philosophy. In 1946, we had this pacifist campaign. 8,000 people, 2,000 went to jail. 1952, 8,000 people went to jail. When I was in Robben Island and Mandela was in Victor Verster prison, and in 1989, he would call some of us to tell us exactly, look, this is what he's doing, because he's negotiating with the apartheid government. And one thing struck me, he says, we want majority rule. There is no compromise. But we must address the fears and the concerns of the white minority. Two things have to go together. Of course, he wanted us to go and talk to the other place. He was consulting, but even after his release. And if you look at the philosophy of his non-violent struggle, the whole non-violent struggle of the many years, I think it shaped his thinking that we want a society where there is no hatred, there is no revenge. That is why the South African had, of course, this what is Truth and Reconciliation Commission, etc., to defeat hatred and to bring about a non-racial society. And it is a task for us to see that the young people who are coming forward also begin to understand and imbibe the whole question of non-racialism and a non-sexist society.
Mr. Ebrahim's mention of or calling Nelson Mandela reminds me of a conversation that Mandela had with India's president. This must have been 1990. This is before the changes came place, after his release. One of the first countries he visited was India. And India's president at the time, Mr. Venkatraman, said to Mr. Mandela, at the end of their conversation, "I will be praying for you." Mandela said, "Thank you very much, but please also pray for Mr. de Klerk, the white president of South Africa." So this is to show, to confirm exactly that he wanted to also to understand the apprehensions of the minority groups. Now, what lessons have we learned? As a historian, one lesson I have learned is that the worst of situations, the most terrible of situations, ultimately does come to an end. Now, sometimes it takes a very long time. But so far, history has shown that some horrible eras have ended. So one thing I always say to myself if I find a particular situation very troublesome, one day less now, every morning when I get up. It's one day less.
I say that with Trump in office every single day.
Another thing I say when activists of all kinds who are very keen on some kind of change, they are impatient, they're disappointed, setbacks. One thing I say to them is, let's at least be a little nicer to one another here. Because so many of us who have great aims and are working also sometimes have, difficult colleagues, we rub one another the wrong way. I think a very major lesson for all of us to learn is to be a little nicer to one another in our team. And then I would just go back to the first about everything, every dark period does have an end. That ultimately love, compassion, kindness, mutual concern. We know this from our family, from our children, from our neighbors, that these positive forces are stronger than hatred and anger. So with that complete confidence, we should move forward.